When I was 6, my mom told me I'd be spending the summer with my grandparents. At that point in my life, I'd never met them before and had never been away from home for longer than a weekend. So, when she broke the news that I'd be leaving for nearly 2 months, I cried on and off for days. It wasn't until she mentioned they had a dog that I started to feel even a little excited about going. Kindergarten was wrapping up, and on the last day, our teacher, Ms. Hain, gathered the whole class onto the rainbow rug for a sharing circle. She had a gentle voice and was one of those young, fresh out of college teachers everyone loved. She asked us to talk about our summer plans, and when it was my turn, I proudly announced I'd be staying with my grandparents. I made sure to emphasize they had a dog. The class giggled and shouted in excitement, and for the first time, I felt a bit better about leaving home. It started to feel like a little adventure. But when the day finally came, I sat trembling in the back seat of my mom's Honda as she drove me miles away from everything familiar. The highway stretched endlessly, and soon the busy city streets faded into a lonely, bumpy road that snaked its way deep into a wooded mountain. "Why aren't there any other cars?" I asked, peering nervously out the window. "Not many people come out this way," Mom explained with a quick glance back at me. "Grandma and Grandpa moved here before you were born because they liked their privacy." She must have seen how uneasy I looked because she quickly added, "Don't worry, sweetheart. You'll have so much space to run around and explore. It'll be good for you." I shifted uncomfortably in my seat, but the idea of exploring outside sounded pretty good. Back at home, we lived on the second floor of an old apartment building, and playing outside wasn't really an option. The kids in the neighborhood were my regular playmates, but our activities were limited to things like coloring or building with Legos. Outside was mostly off-limits, too many cars, too many strangers. Our neighborhood wasn't exactly dangerous, but it wasn't the type of place where you could let kids roam freely. Even when we played on the basketball court nearby, there was always an adult keeping a watchful eye. Those few games of freeze tag on that tiny cement square were pretty much the extent of my outdoor experiences. The thought of having real freedom, being able to run, climb trees, and maybe even catch bugs, gave me a flicker of excitement. But as the drive dragged on, the world around me changed. The trees grew denser, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out the sunlight. The narrow road felt swallowed by the forest, shadows dancing in ways that spooked my overactive imagination. I finally decided to focus on the back of the driver's seat instead of the dark shapes outside. The sun had already set by the time we turned onto a dirt path. We bumped along for what felt like another mile before a large house appeared between the trees. As we crept closer, the dense forest gave way to a clearing, and I got my first glimpse of the property. Beside the main house stood a weathered barn, its red paint faded and peeling, exposing patches of bare wood beneath. As we drove around to the back, a small shed came into view. "We're here," Mom announced, sounding more relieved than enthusiastic. I stayed buckled in my seat, hoping maybe, just maybe, she'd change her mind, say it was a mistake, and take me back home. But instead, she shut off the engine, cutting the static hum of the radio, and climbed out of the car. Not wanting to stay behind alone, I unbuckled and followed her lead. The moment I stepped outside, a chilly breeze hit me, making me shiver. I shot a nervous look at Mom, and she could see how tense I was. Taking my hand, she led me to the side door and knocked. I clung to her hand, my small fingers gripping tightly as footsteps creaked closer from the other side. The door opened, revealing a kind, weathered face with a warm smile. My grandmother stood there, holding a plate of cookies. "Come on in," she chirped, waving us inside with one hand while balancing the plate with the other. I glanced up at my mom, who was now smiling just as warmly. Reluctantly, I followed them inside. The kindness radiating from my grandmother eased my nerves a little, but the house itself quickly sent a chill back down my spine. It was dark, so dark that only the silvery glow of moonlight filtering through the windows lit the entryway. "Oh, let me get some light in here," Grandma said, setting the cookie plate on a coffee table and hurrying to switch on a nearby lamp. When the dim light flickered on, it didn't make the house feel any cozier. Instead, the faint glow gave everything a strange and unsettling vibe. My mom and grandma settled on the couch, diving into conversation like old friends. They'd talked plenty over the phone through the years, but this was their first face-to-face reunion since I'd been born. Mom griped about the long drive, and grandma kept trying to push oatmeal raisin cookies on her. Noticing how shy I was, my mom gently suggested I explore the house. "Your room's upstairs, first door on the right," grandma added with a smile. Slinging my bag over my shoulder, I headed for the stairs, trying not to let my nervousness show. As I climbed, I started counting the steps, a habit I've never managed to shake, even now. By the time I reached the top, I had counted exactly 14 steps. Turning to the right, I saw a short hallway leading to a small bedroom and an adjoining bathroom. But when I glanced to the left, curiosity got the better of me, and I let out a startled scream. At the far end of the left hallway stood my grandfather, a complete stranger to me. He was framed by the light pouring from the doorway behind him, and his shadowy outline sent a jolt of fear through my young imagination. Hearing my cry, Mom rushed up the stairs, her voice panicked. "What's wrong?" she asked, crouching beside me. I was frozen in place, struggling to form the words. "Th, the man," I finally stammered, pointing down the hall. Grandpa didn't say a word. He simply turned away and walked into what I assumed was the master bedroom, closing the door softly behind him. "Oh, don't you worry about him," Grandma said, appearing at the top of the stairs with a faint chuckle. "He's been feeling under the weather. He hopes to come out and say hello tomorrow, once he's had some rest." "Well, I'll be leaving early tomorrow," Mom replied, a bit uneasy. "I've got meetings to get back to." "Trust me," Grandma reassured her, "no one wakes up earlier than your grandpa." The next morning, I was up early to say goodbye to Mom. Up until that point, I'd been the one struggling with this arrangement, but now it was her who seemed reluctant. She hugged me tight, her eyes lingering on mine as she showered me with kisses and repeated, "I love you." If I could have frozen time, I would have stayed in that moment forever. As Grandma predicted, Grandpa was up before anyone else, but instead of spending the morning with us, he went hunting. Mom wasn't thrilled about it, but she couldn't stay any longer, work called. Eventually, she got into the car, waving as she drove off. I stood in the clearing, watching her car disappear down the dirt road until it was swallowed up by the thick trees. Once she was out of sight, the reality of my situation hit me. This was it, I was staying here for nearly 2 months. Grandma broke the silence with a cheerful call. "Come inside, honey. Let's have some breakfast together." The rest of the morning passed uneventfully. I ate bacon and eggs, colored in my sketchbook, and even found a cartoon to watch on the old TV in the living room. It wasn't like the TVs back home, this one had long antennas sticking out of the top, and the channels were limited. But after some fiddling, I found a show and settled in. That's also when I met Grandma's dog, Buffalo. At first, he was wary of me, but by mid-morning, he was curled up next to me on the couch, snoozing peacefully. Everything felt normal, until Grandpa came back. I heard the front door slam open, and Grandpa's deep voice bellowed something to Grandma. My stomach tightened, but I stayed planted on the couch, straining to hear their conversation. Grandma greeted him, but her tone was completely different from the night before. The warm, bubbly woman who'd welcomed me with cookies was gone, replaced by someone who sounded nervous, scared, even. Grandpa barked a command about having lunch ready by the time he came back upstairs. I peeked over my shoulder just in time to see him dragging 2 limp rabbits in one hand as he strode toward the basement door. Before he went down, he turned and fixed his eyes on me. "Don't go poking around in my basement, you hear me, kid?" His voice was gruff and left no room for argument. I nodded quickly, watching as he opened the door and disappeared down the stairs. The sound of the door clicking shut echoed in the quiet house. What's in the basement?" I whispered to Grandma, turning to her with wide eyes. "That's where your grandpa does his work," she explained, her tone light but unconvincing. "He cleans and prepares the rabbits down there. He sells the meat and their skins." The idea of dead rabbits in the house didn't sit right with me. As a child, I felt nothing but sadness for the poor creatures, and a growing sense of unease. I'd never seen anything dead before, and the very thought unsettled me. Still, there was something oddly fascinating about it, though not in a gory or gruesome way. I was too young to comprehend all that. But the concept of life suddenly being gone, that was a strange and morbid mystery I couldn't shake. I decided I had to see the rabbits for myself. Looking back, I wish I hadn't. Maybe if I'd just listened and stayed out of that basement, none of what followed would have happened. The days slipped by, and a pattern began to form. Each morning, Grandpa would leave to go hunting, and by mid-morning, he'd return with 2 to 5 rabbits strung up by their hind legs. Even as a kid, something about it didn't add up. I never saw him bring any meat or pelts back upstairs. Wasn't he supposed to be selling them? Where did they all go? It nagged at me, but Grandpa was a man of few words, and he rarely even looked my way, let alone spoke to me. Grandma was no help either. The cheerful, chatty woman I met when we arrived had been an act, a thin veneer covering who she really was. Most days, she was quiet and withdrawn, speaking to me only when meals were ready or it was time for bed. Otherwise, she stayed in her room, leaving me to figure things out on my own. At the time, I didn't understand I was being neglected, but I could sense that something about this house and these people was off. With so much time to myself, I began exploring the woods with Buffalo, Grandma's dog. He became my constant companion, never straying far from me even without a leash. He wasn't exactly brave, he'd startle at the slightest noise, but he was protective in his own way. He'd jump in front of me to warn me about streams, steep ledges, or animal burrows. Over time, I grew to love him. One afternoon, I was standing at the edge of the tree line, ready to dive into another adventure, when I noticed Grandpa climbing into his truck. I watched as he drove off the property, leaving me behind. I was about to head into the woods when an idea stopped me in my tracks. This is my chance. I can finally see what's in the basement. The opportunity seemed perfect. Grandpa was gone, and Grandma would be in her room until dinner, as usual. I figured I had at least a few minutes, maybe more, to sneak downstairs and have a look. I turned back toward the house, my heart racing with a mix of curiosity and fear. Once inside, I did a quick sweep to make sure Grandma wasn't wandering around. As expected, her door was shut tight. It was almost too easy. I tiptoed to the basement door, careful not to let the old wooden floorboards creak under my weight. To my surprise, the door wasn't locked. My pulse quickened. They're making this way too easy. I eased the door open, wincing at the soft creak of the hinges. The stairs stretched into the darkness below, and a faint musty smell wafted up. "Stay here, boy," I whispered to Buffalo, who had followed me to the doorway. I didn't want him sniffing out the rabbits and giving me away. I started down the steps, counting them out loud under my breath. 1, 2, 3, by the time I reached the bottom, I whispered, 12. Feeling along the wall, I found a light switch and flicked it on. A weak, yellowish bulb cast a dim glow over the room, barely cutting through the shadows. The sight of the basement made my stomach churn, it was even creepier than I'd imagined. For a moment, I thought about turning back. But then I saw a door on the far side of the room. That must be where Grandpa keeps the rabbits. I crept toward the door, the sound of my heartbeat thundering in my ears. As I reached for the handle, a voice boomed from behind me. "So?" Grandpa's gravelly voice echoed in the basement. "You're curious about what's in the old storage closet, huh?" I froze, spinning around to face him. My blood ran cold. Grandpa stood at the bottom of the stairs, a strange smile plastered on his face. But his eyes, they weren't smiling. There was something dark in them, something that made me want to run. "I'm sorry, Grandpa," I stammered. "I'll go back upstairs." But he shook his head. "No, no. You wanted to see what's inside, and I think I'll show you." I couldn't move. Fear had me rooted in place. Grandpa walked past me, his heavy boots thudding against the floor, and grabbed the handle of the door. When he opened it, I felt a wave of confusion and dread. The storage closet was small, maybe 3 feet wide and 4 feet deep. The only thing inside was a dark wooden chest with a large, round lock hanging from its latch. The chest loomed large, filling most of the cramped closet. I stared at it, confused, unsure of what Grandpa was trying to show me. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a key, the metal glinting dully in the faint light. "Let's take a look inside, shall we?" he said, his tone thick with something I couldn't quite place. I was frozen where I stood. I didn't want to see what was in that chest anymore, but I stayed quiet, hoping he'd just open it quickly, let me off with a scolding, and we'd be done. Kneeling, Grandpa unlocked the chest with a deliberate slowness. Then, to my horror, he gestured for me to open it. With trembling hands, I reached for the lid. It was heavy, and as I pushed it up, the hinges groaned in protest. Before I could process what was inside, I felt strong hands grab me from behind. "Grandpa, no!" I screamed, kicking wildly, but he was too strong. My small body was no match for his wiry strength. I thrashed and begged, tears streaming down my face, but he didn't stop. With one rough shove, he forced me into the chest and slammed the lid shut. From outside, his laughter echoed, sharp and cruel. "Maybe this'll teach you not to stick your nose where it doesn't belong," he barked. I pushed against the lid with everything I had, but it wouldn't budge. The lock clicked into place, sealing me in. "Let me out!" I screamed, pounding against the wood, but my cries only seemed to fuel his amusement. I heard his footsteps retreating, the creak of the stairs as he climbed them, and finally, the slam of the basement door. The darkness pressed against me from all sides. My sobs turned into shaky gasps as I tried to get my bearings. I ran my hands over the inside of the chest, trying to feel what else was in there. At first, it was just soft, almost fuzzy. But then my fingers brushed something sticky. As my eyes adjusted to the faint, slivered light sneaking through the cracks, the shapes around me began to take form. My stomach churned. Fur. Wet, matted fur. And blood. It was everywhere, coating the walls of the chest, clinging to my clothes, and soaking into the wood. The chest was filled with the remains of rabbits. Their lifeless bodies pressed against me from all sides. I screamed again, louder this time, but no one came. I don't know how long I stayed in that chest. It felt like an eternity. At some point, exhaustion took over, and my cries quieted into whimpers. Hours must have passed before I finally heard the basement door creak open and the heavy tread of Grandpa's boots. When he unlocked the chest and let me out, the sky outside had turned black, and it was time for bed. Everything changed after that night. Grandpa still let me roam the house and the woods during the day, but when night fell, I was always led back to the basement. Without fail, he'd lock me in the chest until morning. I don't know if it was punishment or some twisted lesson he thought he was teaching me, but it became part of my routine. In the mornings, he'd unlock the chest and take me out hunting with him. My job was to carry the rabbits after he shot them. After breakfast, Grandpa would teach me how to clean the bones. He'd work methodically, binding them with twine and sticks to create strange, intricate symbols. He called them wards, though he never explained what they were supposed to protect against. We'd hang the sigils on trees deep in the forest, the blood still fresh on them. Meanwhile, the rabbit skins would go into the chest, stacked one atop the other. Grandpa claimed they were special, but he never told me why. When the chest was full, always 9 skins, he'd haul them out to his truck and drive away with them. I never saw what became of them after that. Eventually, the summer ended. My mom came to pick me up, and I left that house behind. I never saw my grandparents again. Years passed, and I buried that summer deep in my mind, locking it away like Grandpa had locked me in that chest. Against all odds, I managed to build a good life for myself. I became a social worker, specializing in cases involving neglected children. It felt right, like maybe I could help kids who'd been through some of the same things I had. My life was simple, quiet, and, for the most part, happy. Then, a few days ago, I got a phone call that stirred everything back up. It was from the executor of my grandfather's will. The old man had finally passed, and apparently, he'd left me something. I didn't want anything from him, not his money, not his possessions. But curiosity got the better of me. I agreed to meet with the executor, if only to see what it was. The meeting was in a law office downtown. The place was bustling with lawyers and assistants, their faces tense with the weight of their work. I made my way to a second-floor conference room, climbing the stairs slowly. 12, I muttered under my breath as I reached the top. Inside, I was asked to sit, review some papers, and sign off on them. Skimming through the documents, I noticed my name listed beside a solitary item. "Excuse me," I said to the man across from me. "What does this 1 mean next to my name?" "That's the number of items your grandfather left to you specifically," he explained. I frowned. "So, what is it? What did he leave me?" The man stood, walked to a closet at the back of the room, and pulled a key from his pocket. My stomach dropped as he opened the door. Inside, lying on the floor, was a large, dark brown, wooden chest.